The rancher entered the Apache widow's village, and none planned to let him leave alive. John Miller, a sturdy rancher in his 40s, guided his horse along the narrow trail that wound deeper into the hills. His hat was pulled low against the glare of the late afternoon sun, and his coat was worn from years of hard work on the open plains. John had always been a man of courage, sometimes to the point of recklessness, and today he was venturing into a place he had never dared before. He had heard whispers from travelers about a small Apache village hidden deep in the mountains. It was a place few outsiders dared to enter, and the stories he had heard painted it as a village of widows, women who had lost their husbands in recent raids. They were said to be strong, fearless, and not the kind to welcome strangers with open arms. But John had a purpose. Some of his cattle had gone missing near the mountain pass, and every lead pointed toward this hidden village. The closer he came, the quieter the forest became. Birds no longer chirped, and even the wind seemed to pause in anticipation. John tightened his grip on the reins, feeling the tension in the air. Something about this place felt different. The mountains themselves seemed alive, watching him, warning him. Yet he pressed on, driven by determination and the need to find his lost herd. Finally, through the thick trees and overgrown paths, he saw it. A clearing where small, sturdy homes made of wood and clay sat quietly among the rocks and trees. Smoke rose from the chimneys, curling into the sky like thin fingers. From a distance, John could see the women moving about their daily tasks. Some were tending to small gardens, while others carried water from a nearby stream. Despite the ordinary chores, there was a silent tension in the air, a cautious watchfulness that made him pause. John dismounted and led his horse slowly into the clearing. Every step he took was measured, careful not to startle anyone. He called out politely, introducing himself and explaining that he had lost cattle nearby. The women stopped their work and turned to look at him. Their expressions were unreadable, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and something that made John's stomach tighten, wariness, or perhaps anger. From the center of the village, an older woman stepped forward. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes held the wisdom of many years and the sorrow of too many losses. This was Sohail, the leader of the widows. She observed John closely, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Without a word, she circled him slowly, as if weighing his intentions, examining every movement for signs of deceit. John tried to explain again. He spoke of the cattle, of his farm, and of the journey that had brought him here. His voice was steady, but he could feel the distrust radiating from the women. They whispered among themselves, their voices soft but urgent. John realized quickly that his presence was not welcome. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, but pride and the need to fulfill his purpose kept him rooted. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened, and the temperature began to drop. John decided to set up camp a short distance from the village, thinking it might show respect and caution. He led his horse to a small clearing near the edge of the trees and began preparing his gear. While he worked, he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every rustle of the leaves, every snapping twig made him tense. Night fell slowly, bringing with it a deep, eerie quiet. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the wind and the occasional cry of a distant owl. John sat by a small fire, warming his hands and pondering his situation. The village seemed peaceful, almost serene from this distance, but he knew appearances could be deceiving. These women were not ordinary villagers. They were Apache widows, hardened by loss and fiercely protective of their home. He had to be careful, or his visit could end before it had even truly begun. Suddenly, movement caught his eye. A young woman emerged from the shadows, her steps light and deliberate. She carried no weapon, yet there was a strength in her posture that commanded attention. This was Ayana, one of the younger widows. She stopped a few feet from the fire, her eyes fixed on John. He could see curiosity and caution in her gaze. "I am John Miller," he said gently. "I mean no harm. I am only looking for my lost cattle." Yana studied him for a moment, then spoke softly. "You should not be here," she said. Her voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of warning. "This is sacred land. Outsiders do not come without permission." John nodded. "I understand. I will leave if I must. I need to find my cattle." Yana's eyes narrowed slightly. She seemed to sense his honesty, but she also knew the rules of the village. Every widow had lost someone to outsiders, greed and carelessness. Trust was not given lightly, and John's presence alone was a challenge. She stepped closer, then motioned for him to follow her a short distance away from the firelight. "You do not understand," she whispered. "These women, they will not let anyone leave once they have entered uninvited. You must be careful." John swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to intrude. I truly only want my cattle." Yana studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Come morning, you must speak to Sohail. She will decide what happens next. Until then, do not wander. Do not touch anything, just be still." He nodded again, the gravity of the situation sinking in. That night, sleep was difficult. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, and the shadows around his small camp felt alive. John realized he had entered a world unlike any he had known, a world of strength, sorrow, and hidden power. The Apache widows were more than just survivors. They were a force to be reckoned with, and he had unknowingly stepped into their domain. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, John was awake, alert, and cautious. The fire had burned low and the air was crisp and sharp. He looked toward the village, where smoke still curled gently from the chimneys. He knew that today would be the day he faced the full measure of the widow's judgment. His survival would depend on his wit, respect, and understanding of their ways. For now, he could only wait, watch, and prepare. The journey he had embarked on was no longer just about lost cattle. It was about navigating a world of grief, strength, and silent danger. And deep inside, he knew that leaving the village alive might be far more difficult than he had ever imagined. The mountain stood silent, the village watched, and John Miller sat by the dying embers of his fire, realizing that the adventure he had sought had already turned into a test of courage, wisdom, and respect. And this was only the beginning. The morning sun cast its golden light over the Apache village, illuminating the small homes nestled among the rocky hills. Birds began to sing again, but the air still carried a quiet tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath. John Miller stirred from his uneasy sleep, his body stiff from the cold night. The events of the previous evening had left him alert and cautious. He knew the women of the village were watching him, and their intentions were far from clear. After a quick breakfast of bread and dried meat he had brought with him, John carefully approached the edge of the village. His horse grazed quietly nearby, tethered to a tree. Every step he took was deliberate. He did not want to make a mistake that could provoke the widows. From a distance he saw Ayana, the young widow who had spoken to him the night before. She was walking toward the stream with a small clay pot, her movements calm but purposeful. John called out softly, "Good morning. I hope I am not disturbing you." Yana stopped and turned, her eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed him. "You should not be here," she said again, her voice quiet but firm. "But if you wish to speak with Sohail, you must wait. She will come to you when she is ready." John nodded, understanding that this was a test of patience as much as anything else. He lowered his head slightly and waited. The village itself seemed alive with silent observation. Every window, every doorway seemed to hold a pair of watchful eyes. The widows moved with grace and purpose, yet there was a sharpness in their movements that warned John not to underestimate them. Hours passed. John kept his distance, careful not to touch the homes or interfere with the daily routines of the villagers. He observed quietly, trying to learn as much as he could. He noticed the way the widows communicated without words, using subtle gestures and glances. There was a system, a hierarchy, and a code of conduct that he could barely begin to understand. It was clear that they had survived hardship not just through strength, but through intelligence, unity, and strict rules. Finally, in the late morning, Sohail emerged from her home. The older widow's presence commanded attention. Her steps were measured, and her eyes seemed to look straight into John's soul. She was tall and strong, with the bearing of someone who had faced more loss than most could imagine. When she spoke, her voice was steady, carrying authority without needing to raise itself above the natural sounds of the village. "You are John Miller," Sohail said. "I have watched you since you arrived. You enter a place where few outsiders have ever set foot. You enter a village of women who have lost their husbands. Many would call this intrusion foolish. Tell me, why should we allow you to leave alive?" John swallowed hard. He had expected resistance, but the weight of her words made his heart pound. "I understand your caution," he said carefully. "I came because my cattle are lost, and I hope to find them. I did not mean to disrespect your home. I only wish to retrieve what belongs to me and leave in peace." Sohail studied him for a long moment, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Then she motioned for Ayanna to step forward. The younger widow took her place beside her, silently observing John. "You speak with honesty, or at least with the honesty you believe," Sohail said. "But words are not enough. Many men have entered this village and left with their lives only because they obeyed, only because they understood our ways. You are an outsider. You do not yet understand. You may stay, but you will follow our rules. One misstep, one act of disrespect, and your life will belong to the mountain." John nodded, feeling a mix of relief and fear. "I will follow your rules. Please tell me what I must do." Sohail's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do not wander alone. Do not touch what is not yours. Observe and learn. Tomorrow you will participate in our council. There, we will decide whether your presence here is a threat or a matter of mere curiosity." John agreed, knowing that for now, patience and respect were his only tools. He spent the rest of the day watching the village, trying to understand the daily life of the widows. He noticed how each woman had a role, how every task was shared and coordinated. Some tended to small gardens, growing corn, beans, and squash. Others cared for children, while a few worked at crafting tools or weaving. Even in their sorrow, they had built a village of strength and order. Ayanna approached him several times during the day, offering small pieces of advice. "Do not speak unless spoken to," she said quietly. "Do not reach for what you think belongs to you. Watch the children, the plants, the fires. See how we live. This is your first lesson." John followed her guidance carefully. He did not want to anger the widows, and he realized that every action he took was being silently judged. When he helped with small tasks, like bringing water from the stream or feeding the horses, he did so slowly and respectfully. He began to feel that the village was like a living organism, and he was the outsider who had stumbled into its careful balance. By late afternoon, he felt exhausted, both physically and mentally. The tension of constant observation, the fear of making a mistake, and the effort to adapt to customs he barely understood weighed heavily on him. Yet there was also a fascination growing within him. The widows were not merely survivors of loss. They were keepers of knowledge, wisdom, and discipline that John had never encountered before. As evening approached, the village prepared for the night. Fires were lit, casting warm glows against the cold mountain air. John remained at the edge of the clearing, observing silently. He noticed that the widows did not fear the night. They moved confidently in the shadows, their awareness sharp and their senses keen. He realized that fear alone did not make a person strong. It was control, knowledge, and understanding that created power. Suddenly, a soft sound behind him made him turn. Ayanna stepped from the trees, carrying a small bundle of herbs. She handed it to him without a word. John looked at her, puzzled. "These are for the fire," she said. "It will help keep the smoke steady and keep unwanted creatures away. You are learning slowly, but you are learning." John accepted the bundle with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. I want to understand your ways. I do not want to cause harm." Yana nodded, her eyes meeting his. There was a quiet understanding between them, though unspoken. "Understanding comes with respect," she said. "You have shown some. The rest will follow if you continue to watch and listen." The night grew darker, and the stars began to shine above the mountains. John sat by his small fire, feeling the weight of the day. He thought about his lost cattle, the journey that had brought him here, and the challenge that lay ahead. The council tomorrow would determine whether he remained a visitor or became a prisoner. Every instinct in him told him that the widows were strong and united, and that any misstep could be fatal. Sleep came fitfully. Dreams were filled with shadows of the village, the faces of the widows, and the stern eyes of Sohail. John woke several times during the night, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. Each time he opened his eyes, he felt the weight of the women's gaze upon him, even though they were not there. The fear was real, but so was his growing respect. When dawn arrived, the village was already awake. The widows moved with the precision and grace of people who had lived through hardship and learned from it. John prepared himself, knowing that the day ahead would be critical. He was about to face the council, and his words, actions, and presence would be judged. The path forward was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than finding his lost cattle. He looked toward Sohail's home. The older widow had already stepped outside, her figure strong and commanding. Yana stood beside her, signaling him to approach. John took a deep breath and walked forward, every step deliberate and careful. He felt the eyes of the entire village upon him. The time for observation and patience was over. The council would begin, and the fate of his visit, and perhaps his life, would be decided. John knew one thing clearly: leaving the village alive would require more than courage. It would require understanding, respect, and perhaps even a touch of cleverness. The widows were not just guardians of their land. They were guardians of their honor, their pain, and the memory of those they had lost. And if he failed to respect that, there would be no mercy. As he reached the center of the village, he bowed his head slightly to Sohail, signaling both respect and submission. The older widow regarded him with piercing eyes, measuring the sincerity in his gesture. The council was about to begin, and John Miller understood that this was only the first real test of his journey. The morning was calm, yet beneath the quiet, tension lingered like a shadow over the village. John Miller stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the widows who had come together for the council. Their eyes were sharp, their posture rigid, and their expressions unreadable. Each woman carried herself with dignity and strength, yet John could feel the weight of grief and loss that bonded them together. At the head of the gathering stood Sohail, the leader. Her presence was commanding, a mixture of authority, experience, and quiet fury. She motioned for John to kneel before the circle, a gesture meant to show both respect and submission. John lowered himself slowly, his hands resting on the dry earth, aware of how every movement was being observed and judged. "You have entered our village uninvited," Sohail began, her voice carrying across the clearing. "You claim it was for your cattle. Perhaps that is true. Perhaps you are a man of honesty, but words alone will not prove your intentions. We must test you, for this place is not open to strangers. Here, you are measured not by promises but by actions." John nodded, swallowing hard. He had expected caution, but the formal tone of the council, the silent presence of so many watchful eyes, made the reality far more serious than he had imagined. "I understand," he said quietly. "I will do whatever you ask to prove myself." Sohail's eyes narrowed. "You will face 3 trials. Each will measure your respect, your courage, and your understanding. Fail any of them and your life may belong to the mountain. Succeed, and perhaps you may leave." John felt a chill. The stakes were higher than he had ever faced. Yet he knew that complaining or hesitating would only make matters worse. He nodded again, signaling his readiness. The first trial was a test of respect. Sohail handed John a small clay pot filled with water from the village spring. "Carry this to the garden," she instructed, "without spilling a single drop. The water nourishes our crops just as respect nourishes our village. Treat it carelessly, and you will show that you do not understand our ways." John accepted the pot carefully. The handle was smooth but heavy, and the water sloshed gently as he stepped forward. He moved slowly, mindful of each step, balancing the weight while keeping his eyes on the garden path. Gianna followed silently, her presence a calm guide. The path was narrow, winding between stones and roots. Every time he stepped over a root, he paused, adjusting his balance. The women watched in silence, their judgment sharp but quiet. John could feel sweat forming on his brow, not from physical effort alone, but from the pressure of the gaze upon him. Finally, he reached the garden and poured the water carefully around the base of each plant. Not a single drop was wasted. Sohail watched him closely, then nodded slightly. "You have completed the first trial. Respect is more than words. It is shown through careful actions." John breathed a sigh of relief. One trial completed, but the next two loomed over him, and he knew they would be far more difficult. The second trial was a test of courage. Sohail led John to the edge of the village, where a deep ravine cut through the rocky landscape. A thin rope bridge spanned the gap, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. "Across this bridge lies a small supply of food needed for our children," Sohail said. "It is dangerous. The wind will test you. Fear will test you. Show courage or your journey ends here." John looked at the bridge. It was narrow, weathered, and unstable. Below, the ravine dropped sharply, a reminder of the risks he was taking. Yet he knew that hesitation or refusal would be seen as weakness. He placed one foot on the bridge, testing its movement. The ropes creaked, swaying under his weight, but he continued slowly, carefully. Halfway across, a sudden gust of wind rocked the bridge. John's heart leapt and his grip on the ropes tightened. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and forced himself to focus on each step. Inch by inch, he crossed the bridge, keeping his balance while suppressing the fear that surged within him. When he reached the other side, Sohail's gaze met his. "Courage is not the absence of fear," she said. "It is the will to act in spite of it. You have shown courage, but remember, bravery alone will not save you here. Wisdom and understanding are as important." John nodded, feeling both relief and exhaustion. The first two trials had tested him physically and mentally, but the final trial would challenge something deeper, his understanding of the widows' lives, their sorrow, and their rules. The third trial was a test of understanding. Sohail led John back to the village center, where a small child had been playing near a fire. She motioned for John to approach the child carefully. "This child represents all that we have lost," Sohail said softly. "Your task is to protect and guide without causing harm. Observe, act with care, and show that you can understand the value of life, even when it is fragile." John knelt beside the child, who looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. He spoke gently, introducing himself, and slowly guided the child away from the fire and toward a safe area. He noticed the child's fascination with the flames, the way small hands reached out instinctively. John used calm, steady movements, keeping the child's safety as his primary focus. The widows watched silently. Some whispered to each other, others simply observed. John could feel their judgment as he interacted with the child, aware that any mistake could cost him dearly. Yet he remained calm, speaking softly, encouraging the child and keeping him safe. When the child was finally guided to safety, Sohail spoke again. "You have shown that you can understand our ways, even if only a little. Respect, courage, understanding. These are the pillars of our village. You have faced all three, and though it is not enough to earn complete trust, it is enough to show that your heart is not wholly dishonorable." John exhaled, feeling a mixture of relief and gratitude. He had passed the trials, but he knew that earning trust would take more than completing tasks. He had shown effort, but the widow's judgment was not based solely on actions. It was also based on his intentions, his sincerity, and his ability to learn from their world. Sohail stepped closer, her eyes still sharp. "You may remain in the village for now," she said. "But understand this, every action you take will continue to be observed. One misstep, one act of carelessness, and the consequences will be severe. You are not yet free, John Miller. You are only beginning to understand the weight of entering our home uninvited." John nodded, absorbing every word. He understood that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned through patience, respect, and continued care. He also realized that the widows were not merely testing his abilities. They were testing his character, his heart, and his willingness to truly understand their lives. As the day progressed, John worked quietly alongside the women, helping with chores, fetching water, and assisting in tasks where he was allowed. He noticed the way they communicated silently, the subtle signals and gestures that conveyed instructions without words. Every interaction was a lesson in humility, patience, and observation. Ayanna approached him several times, offering guidance and small corrections. "Do not rush," she said softly. "Patience is part of understanding. Respect is shown in the little things, not in grand gestures." John followed her advice carefully, learning to move with quiet confidence rather than loud determination. He began to notice the rhythm of the village, the ways the widows balanced their work, their grief, and their community. He realized that the village was not just a home, it was a living testament to resilience, strength, and unity. As evening approached, the sun casting long shadows across the clearing, John reflected on the day. He had faced fear, shown respect, and begun to understand a world far different from his own. Yet he knew that the real challenges were still ahead. Trust would not come quickly, and his presence in the village remained tenuous. He returned to his small camp at the edge of the village, feeling both exhaustion and a strange sense of accomplishment. The trials had tested him physically, mentally, and emotionally, and he had survived them. Yet he understood that survival alone was not enough. To leave the village alive and unharmed, he would need to continue learning, observing, and respecting the lives of those who had already endured so much. As night fell, John sat by his fire, watching the village in quiet contemplation. The stars shone brightly above the mountains, but the true light was the strength and unity of the widows below. John realized that he had entered a world of loss, resilience, and unspoken rules, a world where honor and understanding were more powerful than weapons. And though he had survived the first trials, he knew that the real challenge had only just begun. The village had accepted him for now, but every step he took would be watched. Every action, every word, every choice could either earn trust or bring danger. John Miller closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing himself a small sense of relief. He had made it through the council, but he also knew that the journey ahead would require wisdom, respect, and courage in ways he had never imagined. The widows of the Apache village had shown him their rules, their strength, and their power. And now it was up to him to prove that he was worthy of walking among them, even for a short time. The sun rose over the mountains, casting soft light on the village, but John Miller felt no warmth in his chest. The trials of the previous day had tested him and he had survived, yet the tension in the village remained. The widows watched him with silent scrutiny, their expressions calm but unyielding. Every step he took, every word he spoke was being measured. He realized that surviving the council was only the beginning. Now he had to prove himself worthy of staying in the village at all. Ayanna approached him quietly as he prepared to assist with the morning chores. Her eyes were calm but serious, a reflection of the responsibility she carried. "Today, you will learn more about us," she said softly. "Not only our strength, but our grief, our rules, and how we protect what remains of our lives. Pay attention. Every action matters." John nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. The first task of the day was simple but symbolic, carrying firewood from the nearby forest to the village. On the surface, it appeared easy, but the terrain was rocky and uneven. Every step required care, and the widows walked beside him, silently observing. As they moved through the forest, John noticed something new. The women did not just watch for physical effort. They observed his attitude, his respect for nature, and his awareness of the world around him. A small misstep, trampling a sapling, breaking a branch unnecessarily, was not merely a mistake. It was a sign that he did not understand the balance of their lives. John walked slowly, keeping his eyes on the ground and listening to the forest, aware that even the smallest sound could reveal his intentions. Back in the village, the firewood was stacked neatly, and John was allowed to take a brief rest. The villagers gathered around the central area, preparing for the next phase of his trial. Sohail stood at the center, her eyes sharp, her presence commanding. "You have shown patience and care," she said, "but the day is not yet over. Understanding is not complete without empathy, and empathy is tested in action." John's heart sank. He knew that this meant something more challenging, perhaps even dangerous. He looked around, trying to anticipate what the widows might ask of him. Yana stepped forward, guiding him to a small enclosure where injured or sick animals were kept. "Some of these creatures belong to the village," she said quietly. "You must care for them, tend to their needs, and show that you can act with kindness without hesitation." John knelt beside the animals, inspecting each one carefully. Some had minor injuries, others were weak from illness. He began to clean wounds, feed them, and offer gentle encouragement, speaking softly to calm their fear. The widows observed his movements, noting whether he acted with care or merely with mechanical efficiency. John realized that this was a test of character, not skill. His willingness to help, his patience, and his genuine concern were all under scrutiny. Hours passed as John worked with the animals. Sweat ran down his face and his hands ached, but he did not stop. Each action was deliberate, each movement measured, showing that he understood the fragility of life and the importance of compassion. When he finished, Sohail approached him once more, her eyes reflecting a mixture of approval and caution. "You have done well," she said. "Compassion is not given lightly here. You have shown that you are capable of understanding life beyond your own needs. But strength alone does not define you. There is another lesson you must learn today, the lesson of trust." John felt a chill. Trust was not something he had earned yet, not fully, and he could sense that this next task would test him in ways he had not expected. Sohail led him to the edge of the village, where a narrow path wound along the cliffs. Along the path were small markers, indicating traps or pitfalls, though John could not see them clearly. "You must cross this path and deliver a message to a neighboring group," Sohail said. "It is not dangerous if you are careful, but if you ignore the rules, the consequences will fall upon you." John took a deep breath and stepped forward. The path was narrow, and every step required attention. He noticed subtle clues in the environment, disturbed rocks, slight changes in the ground, signs that warned of danger. He moved slowly, aware that any careless step could lead to injury. Yana followed silently, offering guidance only when necessary, allowing him to take responsibility for his actions. Halfway along the path, John spotted a small bundle lying on the rocks. At first he hesitated, unsure whether it was part of the test or a genuine need. Then he remembered Sohail's words, "Compassion and understanding are shown in action." He approached carefully and found a small injured bird, its wing bent unnaturally. John paused, realizing that helping this creature might delay him, but he could not ignore it. He gently cradled the bird in his hands, carefully examining the injury. Using strips of cloth he carried, he fashioned a small splint, wrapping the bird's wing with care. Ayana's eyes met his, and for a brief moment she smiled. It was subtle, but it carried approval. John continued along the path, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. He had acted with thoughtfulness and care, and the widows had noticed. When he reached the neighboring group, he delivered the message with respect and clarity. The journey back was just as careful, retracing his steps and ensuring that he avoided the pitfalls he had noticed. By the time he returned to the village, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Sohail and the other widows were waiting. "You have returned safely," she said. "You have shown patience, compassion, understanding, and the ability to act wisely under pressure. But one lesson remains: trust must be earned, and trust can be lost in a single moment." John nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Trust was not simply about completing tasks or surviving tests. It was about consistent behavior, honesty, and respect for the lives of others. He realized that the widows had not only tested his abilities, they had tested his heart, his intentions, and his capacity for empathy. That evening, John sat by his small fire, reflecting on the day's events. The village was quiet, the only sounds coming from the nearby stream and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. He thought about the widows, their strength, and the pain they had endured. He understood now that their lives were shaped by loss, but also by resilience and determination. Gianna approached once more, carrying a small basket of food. She set it beside him without a word and sat down nearby. For a few moments they simply watched the fire together, the silence comfortable yet filled with unspoken understanding. "You are learning," she said finally. "Not everything can be tested, and not everything can be taught. Some things you must feel, see, and understand for yourself. The village watches you, John Miller, but you must also watch it. Respect is shown in thought as much as in action." John nodded, appreciating the quiet wisdom in her words. "I want to understand," he said. "I want to earn your trust, to leave knowing that I have done no harm." Gianna's eyes softened slightly. "It is not easy. Some will always doubt you, some will always fear for what has been lost, but you have shown a willingness to learn. That is more than many outsiders have done." Night fell fully, and the stars illuminated the mountains above. John sat quietly, feeling a deep connection to the village and its people, even as he remained an outsider. He understood now that surviving the trials was not enough. He needed to live with awareness, respect, and empathy. Every day would be a test, and every interaction could shape the outcome of his stay. He also knew that the widows were not cruel. They were cautious, protective, and determined to safeguard their lives and the memory of those they had lost. John realized that understanding their motives, their rules, and their hearts was essential. Only then could he hope to leave the village unharmed, carrying not only his lost cattle, but also the lessons he had learned about courage, respect, and humanity. As he lay down for the night, John thought about the days ahead. The trials had shown him a glimpse of the widow's strength, but he knew the real challenge was living among them, proving his intentions through consistent action and respect. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time he felt not just fear, but a determination to succeed. Tomorrow, he would face new challenges, and he would need to continue earning trust in small but meaningful ways. The widows of the Apache village had accepted him for now, but their judgment was ongoing. Every step he took, every choice he made would be observed, and he understood that the line between survival and danger was thin, delicate, and constantly shifting. John closed his eyes, the firelight flickering against the rocks, and allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He had come seeking lost cattle, but he had found something far greater, a glimpse into a world of resilience, unity, and unspoken power. The journey was far from over, but he was determined to face it with respect, courage, and understanding. The morning air was crisp and still, carrying the scent of the forest and the quiet strength of the village. John Miller rose with the sun, knowing that today would test not only his courage but the wisdom he had gained during his stay. The previous days had been lessons in patience, understanding, and respect, but he knew that the true measure of his intentions would be revealed today. Every glance from the widows, every gesture, seemed sharper, more deliberate. He felt the weight of their judgment, heavy yet fair, and he prepared himself for the final challenge. Sohail appeared at the center of the village as the first light touched the mountains. Her presence was commanding, her eyes unwavering. She signaled for John to approach, and he stepped forward carefully, aware of the silence that had fallen over the village. The women gathered around, their movements coordinated and precise, forming a circle that both contained and protected the space. "John Miller," Sohail began, her voice steady, "you have spent days among us, learning our ways, observing our lives, and demonstrating respect. You have passed the trials of patience, courage, and understanding. But one final challenge remains, the challenge of wisdom and choice. Today, you must show that you can act not just with skill, but with thought, insight, and honor." John listened intently, understanding that this was more than a task, it was a reflection of his character. He nodded, signaling his readiness. Sohail motioned to Ayana, who stepped forward and handed him a small leather pouch. "Inside this pouch," she said, "is a key. Not a key to a lock, but a key to understanding. It will guide you to the final test. Follow carefully and remember everything you have learned." John took the pouch with care. It was light but significant, a symbol of trust and responsibility. He opened it and found a small folded piece of paper with simple instructions and a small compass. The note instructed him to climb a nearby hill, where he would find a marker that would indicate the next step. The instructions were clear but required careful thought and observation. He set off immediately, moving with deliberate steps through the village and toward the forested hill. The path was familiar yet dangerous, lined with loose rocks and uneven ground. John's experience over the past days guided him. He stepped carefully, avoiding the mistakes that might have endangered him on his first journey. The forest seemed alive, observing him as he moved, and he remembered Ayana's words. Respect is shown in thought as much as in action. After a long climb, John reached the top of the hill, where a single stone marker stood. Around it, the wind blew softly, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The note had instructed him to follow a series of signs and symbols, each representing a choice. One path led to safety, another to a test of courage, and another to reflection and understanding. John paused, considering his choices carefully. He remembered the lessons of patience, empathy, and wisdom. Choosing impulsively could undo all he had learned. He selected the path that required thought and reflection, understanding that true wisdom was not always about the quickest or easiest route. As he moved along the narrow trail, he encountered several obstacles. A fallen tree blocking the path, a narrow ledge over a small ravine, and a cluster of thorny bushes. Each obstacle required care and consideration, and John navigated them using the skills he had learned from observing the widows, the patience to move carefully, the courage to face challenges, and the empathy to respect the land around him. At the end of the trail, John arrived at a small clearing where a young widow was waiting. She held a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Her eyes were calm but serious. "This is your final task," she said softly. "Inside this bundle is something precious to the village. You must carry it to the center of the circle and place it with care. Your actions will determine whether you have truly understood what it means to enter our home with respect." John accepted the bundle carefully. He felt the weight of responsibility and the unspoken significance of the task. As he walked back toward the village, he noticed that the widows were watching silently, their eyes following his every step. The path back was uneven, filled with rocks and roots, but John moved slowly and deliberately, mindful of the lessons he had learned. Every step mattered, every gesture was observed, and every choice reflected his character. When he reached the center of the village, Sohail stepped forward. John knelt and placed the bundle gently on the ground. He did not rush, understanding that the care he showed was more important than speed. The women circled around him, their expressions unreadable but attentive. Sohail examined him closely. "You have returned with care and wisdom," she said. "You have shown patience in your actions, courage in your challenges, and understanding of life beyond your own. You have demonstrated empathy, respect, and thoughtfulness. These are the qualities we value above all else." For a long moment, John remained kneeling, feeling a mixture of relief, pride, and humility. He had entered this village seeking lost cattle, but what he had found was far more profound: a lesson in human connection, resilience, and the strength of community. The widows had not only tested his physical abilities but had also challenged his heart, his mind, and his understanding of life itself. Sohail extended her hand, helping him to stand. "You have passed the final test," she said. "Not because you have completed tasks or faced dangers, but because you have demonstrated the qualities that allow an outsider to be trusted. You may leave the village alive, but remember that trust is fragile. Respect it always, whether in this place or elsewhere." John bowed his head in gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I have learned more than I could have imagined. I will carry these lessons with me always." Yana stepped forward, a small smile on her face. "You have shown us that not all outsiders come with harm," she said. "You have acted with care, and that is rare. Remember that respect is earned in every action, every choice, every day." John nodded, feeling a deep sense of connection and understanding. The villagers, once wary and guarded, now regarded him with cautious acceptance. It was not friendship in the way he had known it before, but it was acknowledgement, a recognition that he had met their standards and respected their lives. Before he left, John took one last look at the village. The homes, the gardens, the fires, and the women moving with quiet purpose. They were more than a community. They were a testament to resilience, strength, and honor. He realized that he had entered their world as an outsider, but he was leaving with insight and respect that could never be taken away. He mounted his horse, carrying the lessons and experiences of the past days in his heart. The path down the mountain was familiar, yet every step reminded him of the care he had learned to practice. He moved slowly, observing the land, respecting its rhythms, and acknowledging the presence of the widows in every step. As he reached the edge of the village, Sohail and Ayana watched him leave. Their eyes held a mixture of caution and respect. John tipped his hat to them, silently thanking them for their guidance, their trust, and their lessons. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had survived not by strength alone, but by understanding, patience, and respect. The journey back to his ranch was quiet. John reflected on the events of the past days, realizing that the true value of his experience was not in finding his lost cattle, but in the lessons he had learned from the widows. They had shown him that strength was more than physical power, courage was more than facing danger, and wisdom was more than knowledge. It was the understanding of life, loss, and the bonds that hold a community together. By the time he returned to the open plains, the sun was setting, casting warm light over his land. The cattle were indeed waiting, safe and sound, but John's mind was filled with memories of the village in the mountains. He understood now that every encounter, every choice, and every action mattered. The widows had taught him that true strength lay not in dominance, but in respect, empathy, and the careful balance between caution and courage. As night fell over his ranch, John sat quietly, reflecting on the journey that had begun with the loss of a few cattle, and had ended with the gain of knowledge, wisdom, and humility. He realized that he would never forget the women of the Apache village, their resilience, their unity, and the silent power of their hearts. And though the mountains and the village faded into the distance, their lessons remained vivid in his mind. John Miller had entered their world as an outsider, and he left it as a man who understood that respect, courage, and empathy were the truest forms of strength. The journey had changed him forever, leaving him with not only a story to tell, but a life transformed by the wisdom of those who had lived through hardship, yet remained unbroken. For John, the mountains would always be a reminder of the courage it takes to step into the unknown, the patience it takes to learn, and the respect it takes to honor lives that are not your own. And though the widows may have seemed merciless at first, he now understood that their strength was born from loss, unity, and the unwavering will to protect what mattered most. As the night deepened, John looked toward the distant mountains, a silent promise in his heart. He would live with the lessons he had learned, carry the respect he had earned, and honor the strength of the widows, not only in memory but in every action he took going forward. The Apache village had tested him, challenged him, and ultimately taught him a truth far greater than survival. That respect, courage, understanding, and empathy were the keys to life, trust, and true connection. And with that understanding, John Miller finally felt a sense of peace and completion.